All right, buckle up for a deep dive. This one's going to really make you think about, well, gender dynamics, to say the least.
Yeah.
We're going deep into women's war, the battle for male submission.
Oh, this is a fascinating one.
It's definitely a controversial one, that's for
Yeah.
sure. It challenges a lot of the mainstream narrative, you know?
Okay.
So it's going to, I think, spark some pretty heated conversations.
Absolutely. And I think what's fascinating here is the author, Sophie-Marie Eve Riker, she doesn't shy away from controversy at all.
No, no.
She really jumps right in, arguing that modern feminism is actually part of this larger war against men.
Okay.
A war designed to undermine traditional masculinity and, like, redefine that power balance in society.
So she's not holding back at all, is she?
No.
It sounds like she's going straight for what a lot of people would consider untouchable sacred ground.
Right. One of the first things she does is try to dismantle this concept of the patriarchy,
Okay.
which is, kind of a cornerstone of feminist theory.
Yeah.
But she argues that this idea of pervasive male dominance, is actually a tool to suppress men and obscure the sacrifices they've made throughout history.
Okay, so that's a bold claim. How does she back that up?
Well, she points to some pretty shocking statistics.
Okay.
Like, for instance, did you know that a staggering 93% of workplace fatalities are men?
93%. Wow, I did not know it was that high. That's a massive number.
It is a huge number. And it's not just workplace deaths.
Oh.
Men also make up 76% of homicide victims
Wow.
and 93% of the incarcerated population.
Goodness, okay.
So she uses these figures to argue that men are disproportionately exposed to risk and violence.
Okay.
And that this reality is often ignored in discussions about gender.
So instead of being privileged, she's saying that men are actually bearing a much heavier burden.
That's exactly her point. She argues that men have historically been the builders, the protectors, the ones who put themselves in harm's way for the sake of society. And she claims that this contribution has been systematically downplayed, even demonized, by feminist narratives.
Okay, so forget what you learned in your gender studies class, right?
Right.
Riker's coming in here and saying, hold on, let's look at the actual data here.
Totally.
Okay, but if she's right, how did we even get to this point?
Yeah.
How did this supposed war on men even begin?
Well, that takes us to her next point. The evolution of the feminist agenda.
Okay.
She argues that what started as a legitimate movement for equality has morphed into something more radical and, in her view, dangerous.
Okay, so she's not saying all feminism is bad,
Yeah,
just that it's gone off the rails a little bit.
exactly. She acknowledges that early feminists achieved important victories, like, securing women's right to vote.
Yeah.
But she contends that the movement has become increasingly hostile towards men, pushing for female supremacy rather than true equality.
And she gets pretty specific too, right?
Yes.
She names names, calls out some pretty prominent figures in the feminist movement.
Yes, she does.
Okay, so who are some of these figures?
One example is Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook.
Okay. Fair.
Riker argues that Sandberg, while advocating for women's empowerment, actually benefits from the very systems she claims to oppose.
Oh, interesting. So she's saying there's a disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality.
Exactly.
That they talk about equality, but they're actually operating within the existing power structure.
Exactly. And she doesn't stop there.
Okay.
Riker is particularly critical of what she sees as a double standard in how social issues are addressed. For instance, she points out that men's issues, like suicide and homelessness, receive far less attention and funding than comparable women's issues.
So she's saying that there's this blind spot, that this focus on women's struggles often comes at the expense of men's struggles.
That's her argument, yes.
Okay.
And this ties into one of the most controversial aspects of the book, which is her exploration of what she calls the dual mating strategy.
All right, here's where it gets really interesting. Tell me more about this dual mating strategy.
So Riker delves into the biological and psychological underpinnings of relationships,
Okay.
arguing that women are actually wired to be attracted to, like, so-called alpha males.
Nope.
For, like, short-term flings, but they then choose beta males for long-term commitment and child rearing.
So hold on, let me unpack that. So she's saying women are biologically programmed to play the field with bad boys, but then settle down with the nice guys.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
And she argues that this strategy, combined with women's ability to conceal it, has led to societal breakdown and high divorce rates.
Wow.
Men, especially the beta males, become vulnerable to being unknowingly cuckolded.
Whoa, cuckolded. That's a loaded term, right?
Right.
It's not exactly something you hear discussed in polite company.
Right, but Riker doesn't shy away from uncomfortable topics.
Yeah, well-
She argues that this dual mating strategy, coupled with the promotion of female sexual liberation without addressing the potential consequences for men, creates a situation where men are being systematically disadvantaged in relationships.
So it's not just about individual choices,
Yeah.
but a larger societal shift that she sees as being harmful to men.
Exactly.
Now, I know this book dives into the history of feminism, too.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit more about that.
So she takes a critical look at the history of the feminist movement, starting with the suffragettes.
Okay.
And she challenges the romanticized view of these women as, peaceful protesters fighting for a just cause.
So the suffragettes weren't the heroes we learned about in school.
Well, she highlights their militant tactics, arguing that they often resorted to violence
Really?
and intentionally sowed division to achieve their goals.
Wow. Okay.
Riker traces this pattern through the different waves of feminism, suggesting that the movement has become increasingly radicalized and hostile towards men over time.
So instead of a steady march towards equality, she sees it as a descent into a gender war.
Exactly.
Right.
And she believes this war has casualties on both sides,
Yeah.
but that men are disproportionately bearing the brunt of it.
Wow. Okay.
Riker connects this perceived war to the rise of what she calls intersectional Marxism,
Okay.
an ideology that she believes is fueling resentment and division in society.
Okay, now I've heard that term thrown around a lot, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
Yeah.
Could you break down what Riker means by intersectional Marxism?
Sure. So she sees it as a framework that divides society into these oppressed and oppressor groups, with men automatically categorized as the oppressors regardless of their individual circumstances.
Okay.
Riker argues that this ideology has infiltrated education, media, and politics, leading to things like cancel culture and the stifling of free speech through political correctness.
Okay, so she's saying that this ideology creates a climate where men are automatically labeled as the bad guys. And any attempts to challenge that label is met with accusations of sexism or misogyny.
Exactly.
It's a pretty bleak picture she paints.
It is.
What are some of the specific areas where she sees this war on men playing out?
Well, one of the most explosive chapters in the book deals with abortion.
Okay.
Riker doesn't mince words. She calls it a silent genocide and a moral crisis.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
Yeah.
I can only imagine the backlash she's getting for that.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely a controversial stance.
Yeah.
But what's interesting here is her focus on the societal impact of abortion. She argues that the psychological trauma many women experience after an abortion is often ignored or downplayed.
Okay.
And she's especially critical of what she sees as a double standard and how feminist rhetoric surrounding abortion often contradicts other positions they hold.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure, she points out that many feminists who advocate for abortion rights also champion the sanctity of life in other contexts,
Okay, yeah.
like opposing the death penalty.
Right, right.
And so she sees that as a contradiction, arguing that it devalues the lives of the unborn.
Okay.
She also takes aim at the way men are excluded from the abortion decision, highlighting the lack of agency they have in a choice that can profoundly affect their lives.
So she's saying that men are denied a voice in a matter that directly impacts them.
Exactly. Riker argues that this lack of agency is fundamentally unjust,
Yeah.
especially when men are still held responsible for child support, regardless of their feelings about the pregnancy.
So it sounds like she's pushing back against what she sees as a lack of empathy and consideration for men in this really deeply personal and often emotionally charged issue.
Right.
Now, there's another topic that she covers that's even more taboo: cuckoldry. I'm curious to hear how she tackles that one.
So Riker uses the term cuckoldry crisis to describe what she believes is a silent epidemic.
Okay.
She highlights the prevalence of paternity discrepancy,
Yep.
citing research that shows it's far more common than many people realize.
So she's saying that there are a lot of men out there raising children who aren't biologically theirs without even knowing it.
That's her argument.
Wow.
And she criticizes feminist responses to this issue,
Oh,
arguing that they prioritize women's sexual freedom while ignoring the emotional toll cuckoldry takes on men.
okay.
She accuses feminist organizations of defending women who engage in cuckoldry without acknowledging the impact on the men involved.
So it sounds like she's saying there's a real lack of sympathy for men in these situations, and she's trying to bring that to light.
Exactly.
Wow.
And this leads into her critique of the institution of marriage itself.
Okay.
Riker uses a provocative term to describe it: the marriage plantation.
Marriage plantation. That's definitely attention-grabbing. Tell me more about what she means by that.
Well, Riker argues that marriage, as it exists today, is a system that exploits men. She claims that men are expected to be the sole providers and protectors, even when women are perfectly capable of contributing financially. And she points to the perceived unfairness of divorce laws, arguing that they often leave men financially devastated and alienated from their children,
Okay.
even when the divorce wasn't their fault.
So she's saying that marriage has become a trap for men, a system rigged against them?
That's her argument.
It seems like she's touching on some raw nerves here.
Yeah.
Anxieties that many men probably feel but are afraid to voice.
Right. That's a key point. She's giving a voice to those anxieties.
Okay.
And that's why her book is resonating with so many men. And it's not just about marriage. She extends this critique to the entire family court system,
Yeah.
arguing that it's inherently biased against men,
Okay.
especially in custody battles.
Okay, let's dive into that a little deeper. What specifically does she point to as evidence of this bias?
She highlights several factors, including the prevalence of what she believes are false accusations,
Okay.
the tender years doctrine that often favors mothers in custody disputes,
Right.
and the financial burden of child support, which she sees as punitive rather than supportive.
So she's painting a picture of a system that's stacked against fathers,
Exactly.
making it incredibly difficult for them to maintain relationships with their children after divorce.
Yes.
Okay.
And she sees this bias as a direct result of feminist ideology,
Yeah.
which she believes has infiltrated the legal system and created a climate of hostility toward men.
And this all ties back to her main point, that there's this systematic effort to disempower men and redefine traditional gender roles.
Exactly. She sees it as a coordinated attack on masculinity itself.
This is heavy stuff.
It is.
I can already feel the pushback this book is generating. But before we get into that, there's one more topic we need to cover in this section, which is false accusations. This is a particularly sensitive issue and one that Riker tackles head on.
Right. She argues that false accusations are being weaponized against men, often with devastating consequences. She's particularly critical of the believe all women narrative, which she sees as undermining due process and actually harming genuine victims of abuse.
So she's saying this approach creates a climate where men are presumed guilty until proven innocent.
Right.
And that's a very dangerous precedent, which can have very real-world consequences.
Exactly. And she doesn't hold back in highlighting the impact of these accusations on families, reputations, and men's mental health. Riker argues that the fear of false accusations is creating a chilling effect, making men hesitant to engage in relationships or even interact with women in certain contexts.
So it's not just about individual cases, but about a broader societal shift that she sees as eroding trust between men and women.
Exactly. She sees it as another front in this gender war. One where men are often portrayed as the villains and women as the victims, regardless of the actual circumstances.
So this is a lot to unpack.
It is.
We've covered a lot of ground here. And it's clear that Riker's book is challenging some deeply held beliefs about gender dynamics.
No.
But we're just scratching the surface. There's much more to explore, including her analysis of the media's role in all of this and, crucially, her vision for the future of masculinity.
Right.
So stay tuned. We'll be diving into those topics in the next part of our deep dive.
Absolutely. But, Riker doesn't just leave us with, this bleak diagnosis of this war on men.
Right.
She actually offers a path forward, a vision for the future of masculinity that's both challenging and empowering.
Oh, so it's not all doom and gloom. It's a glimmer of hope amidst the battlefield.
Absolutely. She's not just about pointing fingers and complaining. She offers solutions, concrete steps that men can take to reclaim their agency, their purpose, their rightful place in society.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What does she propose?
Well, one of the foundational pillars of her argument is the importance of personal responsibility.
Okay.
She's a big believer in men taking ownership of their lives, their choices, their actions.
So no victim mentality allowed.
Not at all. She sees wallowing in victimhood as a trap, one that keeps men stuck in a cycle of resentment and powerlessness. Instead, she urges men to embrace the virtues of hard work, discipline, and self-reliance.
It sounds like she's advocating for a return to more traditional values, the kind of values that have been eroded in recent decades.
That's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
Riker sees traditional values as a source of strength and stability, not just for men, but for society as a whole. She believes that these values have been unfairly demonized by feminist narratives that portray them as oppressive or outdated.
It's interesting how she connects the personal and the political. She's saying that men need to change themselves but also challenge the systems that are holding them back.
Exactly. And one of those systems she targets is the family court system.
Yeah.
She advocates for men to become more aware of their rights, to understand the legal landscape, and to fight back against what she sees as inherent biases against fathers.
That's a pretty tall order, right?
Yeah.
The legal system can be incredibly intimidating, especially for someone going through a divorce or custody battle.
She acknowledges that, but she also emphasizes that men can't afford to be passive.
Right.
They need to be informed, proactive, and willing to stand up for their rights as fathers.
So it's about empowering men to navigate the system, not just complain about it.
Right, and this ties into her broader call for men to become leaders, not just in their families, but in society as a whole.
Okay.
Um,
She seems to be saying that men have a duty to step up to fill the void that she believes has been created by the decline of traditional masculinity.
that's one way to interpret it. She definitely sees a crisis of leadership, not just in the political realm, but in all aspects of life. And she believes that men are uniquely equipped to provide the kind of strong, decisive leadership that's needed to solve the complex problems facing our world.
It's a pretty bold vision. But how does it translate into practical action? What are some concrete steps that men can take to embody this new model of masculinity?
Well, she talks a lot about the importance of mentorship.
Okay. Of older men guiding younger men, passing down wisdom and experience. She also stresses the need for men to create strong communities, to support each other and hold each other accountable.
It's interesting how she emphasizes this collective aspect of masculinity. It's not just about individual achievement, it's about men working together, building something bigger than themselves.
Exactly. And this collective action extends to challenging the systems she sees as harmful.
Okay.
She encourages men to become more politically active, to support candidates who align with their values, and to push back against feminist narratives in the media and education.
So it's about engaging in the culture wars, fighting for their perspective to be heard.
In a way, yes, but it's not just about winning a debate. It's about shaping the future, creating a society where men's voices are valued and their contributions are recognized. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the male mental health crisis. Riker devotes a significant portion of the book to this issue, arguing that it's a direct result of the societal pressures and the demonization of masculinity that we've been discussing. How does she approach this sensitive topic?
Well, she's pretty direct about it. She calls out what she sees as a lack of support and understanding for men who are struggling with, depression, anxiety, other mental health challenges. She points to the alarmingly high suicide rates among men as evidence of a system that's failing them.
Yeah, it's a heartbreaking statistic, and it's often overshadowed by the focus on women's mental health.
Yeah.
Which is important,
Right.
but,
Exactly. Riker argues that there's a double standard at play here.
Yeah.
That men's pain is often minimized or dismissed.
Yeah.
She believes that this is partly due to the stereotype of men as strong and stoic, a stereotype that prevents many men from seeking help when they need it.
So she's saying that traditional ideas about masculinity can actually be harmful, preventing men from expressing their vulnerability and getting the support they need.
Exactly. And she challenges men to break free from that restrictive mold, to create spaces where they can be open and honest about their struggles without fear of judgment.
That's a powerful message. But what concrete solutions does she offer to address the male mental health crisis?
Well, she advocates for a number of things. Increased funding for male-specific mental health services, greater awareness of the unique challenges men face, and the creation of more support groups and communities where men can connect with each other and share their experiences.
So it sounds like she's calling for a complete overhaul of how we approach men's mental health, moving away from this one-size-fits-all model that often fails to address the specific needs of men.
That's a good way to put it. She also emphasizes the importance of role models, of men who are successfully navigating the complexities of modern life while embracing their masculinity in a healthy and positive way.
So it's not about rejecting masculinity altogether, but about redefining it, finding a way to be a man in the 21st century that's both authentic and empowering.
Exactly. And this leads into her discussion of another issue that disproportionately affects men: homelessness.
Okay.
Riker criticizes feminist organizations for what she sees as their indifference to the plight of homeless men.
That's a pretty harsh accusation. Why does she believe that feminist groups are ignoring this issue?
Well, she argues that it doesn't fit into their narrative of male privilege.
Okay.
The image of a homeless man on the street challenges the idea that men are the dominant force in society.
So she's saying that there's a blind spot in the way we approach homelessness, that the focus on women and children often leaves men out in the cold, literally and figuratively.
That's her point, and she connects this to her broader argument about the devaluation of men and masculinity in modern society. She sees homeless men as a symbol of a system that's failing them, a system that's quick to demonize them but slow to offer them help when they're down on their luck.
It's a sobering thought, and it makes you wonder if we're doing enough to address the root causes of homelessness, particularly among men. Now, Riker also spends a considerable amount of time discussing the issue of workplace deaths. Why is this a particular focus for her?
Well, she sees it as another example of men bearing a disproportionate burden,
Okay.
often without recognition or appreciation. She points out that men are far more likely to die on the job than women, particularly in dangerous industries like construction, mining, and logging. And she argues that these sacrifices are often taken for granted, that society simply accepts them as the price of progress.
It's interesting how she connects this back to her earlier point about men as the builders and protectors of society. She seems to be saying that men are still expected to put themselves in harm's way, even in the modern world.
Exactly. And she criticizes the lack of attention paid to these deaths.
Yeah.
The way they often become just another statistic.
Right.
She argues that we need to honor the men who risk their lives every day to keep our society functioning.
So it's about recognizing the hidden costs of progress.
Yeah.
The human toll that's often obscured by the focus on efficiency and productivity.
Right. And this ties into her critique of the media,
Okay.
which she sees as complicit in perpetuating negative stereotypes about men and downplaying their contributions.
Okay, let's talk about the media.
Yeah.
Riker doesn't mince words in her assessment of how men are portrayed in the news, in movies, and on TV. What are some of her main criticisms?
Well, she sees the media as a major force in shaping public opinion.
Okay.
And she argues that it's been incredibly effective in promoting feminist narratives while silencing dissenting voices.
Okay.
She points to the way men are often portrayed as, bumbling, incompetent, or even dangerous.
Right.
While women are presented as strong, independent, and virtuous.
It's interesting how she connects this back to her earlier point about the suffragettes using the media to advance their agenda. She seems to be saying that this pattern has continued, that feminist narratives have become so entrenched in the media that it's difficult to challenge them without being labeled a sexist or a misogynist.
That's exactly her point. She argues that the media creates a climate of fear where men are afraid to speak out, afraid to express their views for fear of being ostracized or even attacked.
So it's not just about biased reporting, but about a broader cultural shift that's created a chilling effect on free speech, particularly for men who hold views that challenge the dominant narrative.
Right, and she sees this as a dangerous trend, one that's eroding trust in institutions and fueling division and resentment in society.
It's a bleak picture she paints. But does she offer any solutions? Is there any way to counter this perceived media bias?
She advocates for a number of things, including increased media literacy, the creation of alternative media outlets that provide a different perspective, and a more critical approach to consuming news and information.
So it's about becoming more discerning consumers of media, questioning the narratives we're being fed, and seeking out alternative sources of information.
Exactly. And she also encourages men to be more vocal, to challenge biased reporting and to share their own stories and perspectives. She believes that men need to reclaim their voice in the public square, to push back against the negative stereotypes and the silencing tactics that she believes are so prevalent in the media today.
It's a call to action, a challenge to step up and engage in the battle of ideas. But isn't that risky? I mean, she herself has been subjected to vicious attacks for simply expressing her views.
She acknowledges the risks, but she argues that the stakes are too high to remain silent.
Yeah.
Riker believes that the future of masculinity, and indeed the future of our society, depends on men finding their voice and challenging the narratives that are being used to disempower them.
It's a powerful message, one that's likely to resonate with many men who feel marginalized, silenced, and misunderstood. But even if we accept her diagnosis, even if we agree that there's a war on men, what can we do about it? Is there any hope for the future?
She believes there is. She sees a growing awareness of men's issues, a burgeoning men's rights movement that's gaining momentum and challenging the status quo.
Okay.
She also points to the resilience of men, their ability to adapt, overcome adversity, and create new paths forward.
So it's not just about fighting back against a perceived enemy, but about building something new, creating a better future for men and for society as a whole.
Exactly. And this leads into her discussion of another area where she sees this war on men playing out: education.
Okay.
Riker has some pretty strong opinions about how boys are being treated in the modern education system.
Okay, this is a big one. Tell me more about her critique.
She sees the education system as another battleground in this so-called gender war.
Right.
She argues that boys are being systematically disadvantaged in the classroom, that their unique needs are being ignored, and that they're being subjected to a curriculum that's often hostile to traditional masculinity.
This is a controversial claim. But what evidence does she offer to support it?
She points to a number of factors, including the feminization of the teaching profession, the emphasis on emotional intelligence over physical activity, the zero-tolerance policies that often punish boys more harshly than girls for the same behavior, and the promotion of curricula that, she believes demonize traditional male roles and values.
So she's saying that boys are being taught that masculinity is toxic, that they need to suppress their natural instincts and conform to a more feminine model of behavior.
That's one way to interpret it. And she argues that this is having a detrimental effect on boys' development, leading to lower academic achievement, increased behavioral problems, and a sense of alienation and disenfranchisement.
It's a pretty bleak picture she paints. But what solutions does she offer? How can we create a more equitable and supportive learning environment for boys?
Well, she advocates for a number of things, including more male teachers, especially in the early grades, a greater emphasis on physical activity and hands-on learning, and a curriculum that celebrates the positive aspects of masculinity, such as courage, strength, and leadership.
So it's not about rejecting feminism altogether, but about finding a way to balance the needs of boys and girls, recognizing that they have different strengths and learning styles.
Exactly. And she also emphasizes the importance of father involvement in education,
Okay.
arguing that fathers have a crucial role to play in supporting their sons' academic and emotional development.
So it sounds like she's calling for a more holistic approach to education, one that takes into account the unique needs of boys and recognizes the importance of male role models.
That's a good way to put it. And she believes that this is essential not just for the well-being of boys, but for the future of society as a whole.
This is a lot to process.
It is.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the personal to the political, from the psychological to the societal. It's clear that Riker's book is a challenge to the status quo, a call for a radical rethinking of gender dynamics. But before we delve into the broader implications of her arguments, we need to explore one final piece of the puzzle: her analysis of the media's role in shaping public opinion and influencing policy. That's where we'll pick up in the final part of our deep dive. All right, so we've explored the battlefield, examined the casualties, and even, glimpsed a potential path to victory.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up our deep dive into women's war, we need to talk about the media's role in all this.
Right.
Riker is incredibly critical of the media, arguing that it's become a weapon in this so-called gender war.
Yeah, and what I find fascinating about her analysis is that she traces this media bias all the way back to the suffragette movement, suggesting that these feminist narratives have been shaping public opinion for over a century. She sees this as a deliberate and strategic campaign to demonize men and promote a particular worldview that, in her view, is ultimately harmful to society.
So she's saying it's not just about individual journalists being biased, but about a systemic problem, a deep-rooted ideology that kind of permeates the entire media landscape.
Right, exactly. It's like this undercurrent that's always there.
Okay. But how does this play out in practice? What are some concrete examples of this media bias?
Well, she points to a number of things, like, for instance, the relentless focus on the gender pay gap,
Okay.
the portrayal of male victims of domestic violence as the perpetrators,
Right.
the downplaying of male suicide rates,
Okay.
and the constant barrage of negative stereotypes about men that we see in movies, TV shows, advertising. Riker argues that this constant drip feed of negativity really has a profound impact on public perception, shaping the way we think about gender roles, relationships, even basic human nature.
It's like she's saying the media is creating this distorted reality where men are constantly portrayed as the villains and women are the victims, regardless of the actual facts. And then this, in turn, influences, policy decisions, legal precedents, even our personal relationships.
Exactly. She sees the media as a powerful tool for social engineering, one that's been used effectively to advance a feminist agenda that, again, in her view, is ultimately detrimental to both men and women.
Okay.
But, Riker doesn't just leave us with this sense of despair. She offers solutions, practical steps that we can take to counter this media bias.
All right, I'm all ears. What does she propose?
Well, first and foremost, she emphasizes the importance of media literacy, of becoming more critical consumers of news and information.
Okay.
She urges us to question the narratives that we're being fed, to look for hidden agendas, and to seek out alternative sources of information that provide a different perspective.
So it's about being more discerning, more skeptical, not just passively absorbing whatever the media throws at us. But that's not easy, is it? I mean, we're bombarded with information from all sides these days. How do we even know where to start?
That's a good point. It can be overwhelming. She suggests, several strategies like diversifying our media consumption,
Okay.
reading articles from both liberal and conservative outlets,
Right.
comparing different perspectives, looking for evidence-based reporting rather than just emotionally charged rhetoric.
Okay.
She also encourages us to support independent media outlets that are less beholden to corporate interests or ideological agendas.
So it's about taking control of our information diet, becoming more informed and engaged citizens rather than just passive consumers of media propaganda.
Exactly.
But what about those of us who want to do more than just consume information? What if we want to actively challenge the media's narrative?
Well, Riker encourages men to become more vocal, to speak out against biased reporting, and to share their own stories and perspectives. She believes that men need to reclaim their voice in the public square to push back against the negative stereotypes and the silencing tactics that she sees as so prevalent in the media today.
It's a call to action.
Yeah.
A challenge to step up and engage in the battle of ideas.
Yeah, it is.
But isn't that risky? I mean, she herself has been subjected to vicious attacks for simply expressing her views.
She acknowledges the risks, but she argues that the stakes are too high to remain silent.
Okay.
Riker believes that the future of masculinity, and indeed the future of our society, depends on men finding their voice and challenging the narratives that are being used to disempower them.
It's a powerful message. One that's likely to resonate with a lot of men who feel marginalized, silenced, and misunderstood. But even if we accept her diagnosis, even if we agree that there's this war on men, what can we do about it? I mean, is there any hope for the future?
She believes there is. She sees a growing awareness of men's issues, a burgeoning men's rights movement that's gaining momentum and challenging the status quo. She also points to the resilience of men, their ability to adapt, overcome adversity, and create these new paths forward.
So it's not just about fighting back against a perceived enemy, but about building something new, creating a better future for men and for society as a whole.
Exactly.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the battle lines, we've examined the casualties, and we've even glimpsed that potential path to victory. Women's War is a challenging book, one that's sure to provoke strong reactions. But whether you agree with Riker's conclusions or not, she's raising some really important questions about gender dynamics, the role of the media, and the future of masculinity in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're intrigued by Riker's arguments and want to, explore them further, you can find Women's War, The Battle for Male Submission on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. It's a book that will challenge your assumptions, make you think differently about the world around you, and perhaps even inspire you to take action.
Well, this deep dive has been a journey into the heart of a cultural conflict that's shaping our world. And, it's a conflict with high stakes and no easy answers.
No.
But one thing is for sure. The conversation about gender is far from over.
Definitely not.